The silence in the courtroom was oppressive, heavy like a lead blanket. Covering everyone present, Matthew Carter, with slumped shoulders and deep-set eyes, sat in the center of the room, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. His appearance conveyed exhaustion and resignation, but in his gaze there was something more, a desperate, almost inaudible plea for redemption. This was the end of the line for him, but he only wanted one last thing before the inevitable. "Let me see Titan," he had begged the judge, and against all expectations the request was granted. The wooden doors opened and all eyes turned to the robust figure of a German shepherd being led by an officer. Titan entered slowly, his ears alert and his deep eyes sweeping the room until they found Matthew. As soon as he saw him, the dog pulled hard on the leash, letting out a short howl that sliced through the silence like a sharp blade. Matthew lapsed into tears, his previously controlled expression breaking into pure pain. "My God," someone in the audience murmured, unable to contain their emotion. At witnessing the reunion, Titan threw himself at Matthew as soon as he was released, and the man on his knees embraced the dog as if his life depended on it. "I'm so sorry, my friend," he whispered, his voice trembling, and barely audible tears flowed endlessly as his hands ran through Titan's thick fur. It was as if he was trying to imprint that moment on his soul, knowing it would be the last. Matthew's eyes, filled with pain, turned toward the judge as if pleading for something more, a change, a miracle, anything. But then something unexpected happened. Titan began tugging at Matthew's suit pocket with his teeth. Persistent and determined, Matthew tried to gently push him away, confused, but the dog kept going until a crumpled piece of paper fell to the ground. The defense attorney, sitting just a few feet away, grabbed the paper, and when he opened it, his face paled. He stood up abruptly, staring at the judge. "Your Honor, we need to suspend the proceedings immediately. This could change everything." The courtroom plunged into chaos. Whispers filled the room as the judge slammed his gavel, demanding order. Matthew looked at the lawyer and then at the paper, his mind spinning. What did that piece of paper mean? He didn't remember putting anything there, and how did Titan know it was there? For a moment hope gleamed in his eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by fear, because in his experience hope always came with pain. The courtroom fell into tense silence, broken only by the rustling of the lawyer's clothes as he hurried to the judge, holding the piece of paper as if it were a sacred artifact. Matthew's face was frozen in a mixture of confusion and anxiety as he watched the movements around him. Like a man on the edge of a cliff, he held tight and tightly, the dog's warmth being his only anchor in that surreal moment. "What's happening?" he thought, but no one seemed willing to give him answers. The judge, with his stern and incredulous expression, took the paper from the lawyer's hands. Adjusting his glasses, he began reading silently, and as his eyes scanned the lines, his rigid posture changed. He furrowed his brow, his expression wavering between doubt and surprise. Is this serious?" he asked, looking up at the lawyer, who nodded affirmatively. The audience, restless, tried to decipher what was happening, while Matthew felt his heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo through the room. "Mr. Carter," the judge finally said, turning his attention to Matthew, who instinctively held Titan tighter, "do you recognize this paper? These details?" Matthew shook his head, confusion clear on his face. "I have no idea what this is, Your Honor," he replied, his voice horror and choked, but inside something was starting to stir, an unknown fear mixed with a spark of hope. After all, how had this piece of paper ended up here, and why did Titan seem to know of its existence before the judge could continue? The defense lawyer intervened urgently. "Your Honor, we need an immediate recess to verify this information. If the content of this document is authentic, it could prove my client was framed. It might be the evidence we've been missing to dismantle the entire case against him." The statement hit the courtroom like a bomb, causing murmurs and surprised looks. Matthew's eyes widened and he looked at the lawyer with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "Framed? What is he talking about?" While the judge considered the request, Matthew felt Titan's paws on his lap as if the dog were trying to calm him down. He looked at the animal and saw something in his eyes, not just loyalty but a kind of almost human certainty, as if Titan knew exactly what he was doing. For the first time, Matthew allowed himself to think that maybe this moment, this encounter, wasn't just a coincidence. "You've always known, haven't you, boy?" he murmured, stroking the dog with a tenderness he could hardly contain. The judge finally gave his ruling. Banging the gavel with force. The hearing will be adjourned until the information is verified. Mr. Carter, you will be transferred back to detention, but under special measures given the potential impact of this evidence. Matthew's heart sank again. Hope had appeared, but as always it seemed just out of reach. He looked at Titan, who was reluctantly pulled away by an officer, and whispered, "Hang in there, my friend, maybe it's not over yet." Back in the cold, empty cell, Matthew felt the weight of silence fall on him like an invisible chain sitting on the small mattress. He stared at the floor, unable to process what had happened in court. The image of Titan being taken against his will still burned in his mind. He had never seen the dog act that way, so determined, so human. It was almost as if Titan had understood something Matthew still couldn't grasp, but the more he thought about it, the more that uncomfortable feeling grew. What if that piece of paper could really change everything? Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the defense lawyer worked frantically. The paper pulled from Matthew's pocket contained details of a bank transaction and names that made no sense at first but seemed to connect to a larger network. He immediately hired a document expert to verify the authenticity of the writing and the origin of the information. Every second felt like an unbearable burden as the answers did not come. The pressure was immense. This could be a false lead, or even worse, a carefully planted trap to throw sand in the case. In the cell, Matthew replayed the events that had brought him there. He closed his eyes and was transported back to the past. The day the police knocked on his door, the shock of being accused of a crime he knew he hadn't committed, and the trial where every witness seemed aligned to destroy him. He remembered how his lawyer had tried hard to find flaws in the case, but everything seemed too soft, solid. Until that moment in court, Matthew had accepted there was no way out, but now the appearance of that paper planted a doubt in his heart. Had someone planned this to incriminate him? Titan, the name echoed in his mind like a persistent whisper. Matthew knew the dog was not just a companion, he was his savior, his last connection to the life he had lost. But now one question haunted him: who had put that paper in his pocket? He couldn't remember anything like it, and that only deepened the mystery. Had Titan found something while he was with him and hidden it somehow? The idea seemed absurd, but in that moment Matthew was willing to believe anything. The next morning the lawyer returned with news. Matthew, he began his words heavy with urgency. This document, it's not just authentic, it proves that someone transferred money to an account in your name days before the crime. It was done to make it look like you had a motive. Matthew's heart raced. He knew he was innocent, but hearing that felt like an electric shock. That means someone set it all up. He said, his voice low but full of emotion, "Do you think this will be enough?" The lawyer hesitated, his hands tightening around the file. "We still don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, but Matthew, we closer to the truth than ever before, and somehow your dog seemed to know this before any of us." Matthew took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the lawyer. "Then let him go all the way," he said with a determination he thought he'd lost long ago. As the cell door closed again, he knew that the next move could change everything. The sun began to rise, but Matthew had barely slept. The tension of knowing that his freedom depended on an unresolved mystery kept him awake. He mentally replayed every moment before his arrest, searching for any detail that could explain how that piece of paper had appeared. Every time he closed his eyes, it was always Titan who appeared. The German shepherd's eyes, deep and loyal, seemed to hold a secret. He couldn't unravel something in Titan's behavior, especially the insistence on protecting him during the trial, left Matthew uneasy. Meanwhile, in the lawyer's office, the document was being carefully analyzed. There was one name in particular that stood out: a powerful businessman with political ties, someone who at first glance seemed to have no direct connection to Matthew. The discovery was unsettling. Why would this man get involved in something like this? The lawyer decided to investigate further, but knew he was treading dangerous ground. The clues pointed to a conspiracy larger than they could imagine, something that involved much more than just the crime Matthew had been convicted of. In prison, a guard brought a message for Matthew. A visit was scheduled for the afternoon. The name was not provided, which was already strange. Anxiety increased as unexpected visits rarely meant good news. When he arrived at the visiting room, Matthew found a woman sitting on the other side of the glass. She was well dressed with a cold, calculating demeanor, but there was Something in her eyes that betrayed her tension. "You don't know me," she began, "but I know who you are, and more importantly, I know who put you here." Matthew remained silent, watching every move the woman made. She seemed hesitant but continued. "The man whose name is on that document, he has more secrets than you can imagine. And you were just a pawn in his game. What he did to you was personal." Matthew leaned forward, his fists clenched. "Personal? I don't even know him. Why would he do this to me?" The woman looked away as if carefully considering what she was about to say. "Because he needed someone to blame, and you were the perfect target. You're not as unknown as you think." Her words opened a wound Matthew didn't even know existed. He tried to understand what she meant, but the woman didn't offer any details. "Before leaving, she left a note with the lawyer. He'll know what to do with this," she said without looking back. The visit, though brief, threw Matthew into a spiral of doubts and fear. Who was this woman? How did she know so much? And above all, what did it mean that he wasn't as unknown as he thought? The questions echoed like a storm in his mind. Back in the cell, Matthew held his head in his hands. He felt as if he was on the verge of discovering something that would change everything, but he still couldn't piece the puzzle together. Deep down, he knew time was against him. But there was one unshakable certainty: the key to everything was still Titan. Something about the dog, something he had tried to show, was the missing piece. And Matthew knew that if he wanted to make it out alive, he needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. Matthew spent hours lying in the narrow bed, the woman's words echoing in his mind. "You're not as unknown as you think." Something inside him told him this was tied to Titan. He remembered the day he first saw the dog at the shelter, hurt with deep scars but with a determined look that captivated him instantly. Titan's past, up until then a mystery, seemed to be slowly revealing itself, and anxiety grew within him. The next day, the lawyer brought an envelope with an address and a phrase: "Ask about the fire." Matthew froze when he recognized the address. It was the shelter where he had adopted Titan. The memory of that place resurfaced, bringing a mix of sadness and curiosity. Something in the shelter's past and in Titan's past seemed directly linked to his situation. Matthew's instincts told him he needed the answers the lawyer was going to find. Meanwhile, the tension in the prison was rising. Matthew began noticing strange behaviors. A group of inmates watched him in the yard, speaking in low voices and exchanging furtive glances. Even more disturbing was the behavior of one of the guards, who seemed to be constantly in contact with these men. Distrust knotted Matthew, and he began questioning whether he was truly safe there at night. Footsteps echoed down the hallway and stopped in front of his cell, only to disappear moments later. The feeling of being watched made every minute a torment. When the lawyer returned, his worried expression didn't bring any relief. He revealed that the shelter had been destroyed in a mysterious fire years ago, the same one that left marks on Titan's body. Even worse, old records showed that Titan had been rescued from a property owned by the man behind Matthew's imprisonment. Each discovery seemed like a piece of a puzzle Matthew never knew he was putting together, but the picture starting to form was terrifying. Titan, the dog who had been his only source of hope, now seemed to be the key to unraveling a dark secret. Matthew felt the weight of responsibility. He needed to find Titan, not only because the animal meant everything to him, but because something in Titan's scars and his past held the answer that could change everything. Lying in the cold cell, Matthew knew time was running out. The connections that once seemed improbable now felt inevitable. Whatever Titan had witnessed in the past, he was determined to uncover, even if it meant facing something much bigger than he ever imagined. The lawyer returned the next day with a look of heavy tension on his face. He brought a series of old documents, burned photographs, and more alarmingly, a police report of the fire at the shelter. "Matthew, this goes far beyond what we expected," he said, sliding the papers across the table in the living room. Among the records was a photo of Titan as he was before being rescued, thin, injured and chained on a rural property. The property, to Matthew's horror, belonged to John Everett, the same man who had built the case against him. Matthew felt a KN form in his stomach. He read every line with wide eyes, the words blurring as a disturbing truth began to surface. Everett was known for his involvement in shady business, including an underground dog fighting ring. Titan wasn't just a survivor of the fire, he was a living witness to the atrocities committed at that place, and now it seemed that Everett was willing to do anything to keep these secrets buried. As he absorbed the information, Matthew began to connect the dots. The fire that destroyed the shelter wasn't accidental, it was a desperate attempt to erase evidence, including the dogs who could bring down Everett. Somehow Titan had escaped, but he carried the marks of that terrible past on his body and in his behavior. Now Matthew understood why he had been the target of a setup. He was the one who had unknowingly protected the only witness who could expose everything. That same night back in his cell, Matthew felt the weight of the conspiracy around him. The footsteps in the dark now seemed deliberate, and the glances exchanged between the prisoners and guards made it clear that something was about to happen. He didn't know who to trust, but he was certain that time was running out. He needed to get out of there, but before that he had to make sure Titan was safe. If something happens to me, he needs to be protected, he thought with a determination burning in his chest. The next day, Matthew asked his lawyer to contact an animal protection group. He knew Titan might be in danger, especially now that Everett could realize the dog's secrets were about to come to light. The lawyer hesitated but agreed, seeing the seriousness in Matthew's eyes. I'll do it. But you need to hold on, Matthew. Don't let them silence you, the man said before hurriedly leaving. Now alone in his cell, Matthew began to plan his next move. He knew he couldn't wait for justice. Passively, Titan's fate and the truth about Everett were intertwined, and he needed to find a way to expose everything. What he didn't know was that at that very moment forces were moving to ensure he would never get that chance. The darkness of the night brought an unsettling silence. Matthew, lying in his cold cell, felt that something was different. It wasn't just the growing tension from recent discoveries, but the feeling that he was being watched. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the discomfort, but the sound of soft footsteps echoing down the corridor made him sit up immediately. Something was happening, and he knew he needed to stay alert. The footsteps stopped right in front of his cell. Matthew held his breath, trying to listen more carefully. Suddenly a low, firm voice broke the silence. Carter, we need to talk. It was the guard he recognized from his daily rounds, but there was something different in his tone. The man seemed cautious, as if he were risking a lot by speaking. Matthew moved closer to the door. Intrigued, what do you want with me? He asked, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. The guard looked around before answering. There are things happening here that you don't fully understand. Powerful people are involved, and you're closer to the truth than you should be. Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. If you know something, why are you here? Why tell me this now? The guard hesitated before responding, his expression full of tension. Because I believe you're innocent, and also because they're moving fast. I don't know how long I can protect you. Before Matthew could ask more questions, the guard slid an envelope under the door. This was left for you. Use it carefully. I won't be here to help you next time. Without saying anything else, he quickly stepped away, disappearing down the hallway before Matthew could thank or question him. With trembling hands, Matthew took the envelope. Inside there was an old photograph and a handwritten note. The answers are closer than you think. Trust what you know. He held the photo under the dim light of the cell. It was an image of Titan, much younger, chained in a place that looked like a rural property. In the background there was a barn with a familiar symbol painted on the wood. Matthew tried to remember where he had seen that symbol, but his mind seemed like a blur. All he knew was that the photo was another piece of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly complicated. In the following days, the feeling of being watched grew. Matthew noticed the lingering glances from some prisoners, and even other guards. He didn't know who was on his side and who might be working against him. Despite this, the photo in the envelope gave him a new sense of determination. He needed to figure out where that barn was and what the connection between Titan and the man behind his imprisonment was. When the lawyer returned, Matthew shared the photo and the note. Does this mean anything to you? He asked, trying to control his anxiety. The lawyer studied the image for a moment before shaking his head. Not immediately, but I'll look into it. This symbol, it could be an important clue. I'll start there. As the lawyer left, Matthew felt a mix of hope and apprehension. He knew time was against him, but for the first time it seemed like the truth was within his reach. The following morning brought a heavier air than usual in the prison. Matthew could feel the tension building, as if something big was about to happen. As he walked to the cafeteria under the constant watch of the guards, he noticed More intense looks and murmurs among the other inmates. It wasn't paranoia there. Was an atmosphere of expectation in the air, and he was right at the center of it. He knew he had to stay calm, but his instincts told him danger was approaching fast. In the visitation room, the lawyer arrived with a look of deep concern. He placed some papers on the table, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at Matthew. "I found the barn in the picture," he began, his voice steady. "It's on a property that's been abandoned for years, but it belongs to a man we know well, John Everett." Matthew felt his blood run cold ever again. "Of course, what else did you find?" The lawyer sighed before continuing. "The barn was used as a meeting point for illegal activities, and it seems that Titan was rescued from there during an operation that almost uncovered the entire truth about Everett's scheme." Matthew closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the words. The weight of what was happening started to hit him harder. "So now what? How does this help my case?" he asked, trying to stay calm. The lawyer looked at him seriously. "We need to link Titan directly to the case. If we can prove he was there and that Ever is tied to him, this could be the turning point. But Matthew, this also means we're dealing with something very dangerous. There are people who don't want this truth to come out." Back in the cell, Matthew felt torn between hope and fear. He knew he was approaching something big, but he also felt that every step put him at risk. As he reflected, he remembered moments with